everyone, welcome to my book channel. I'm Zenlu and today I'll be wrapping up my September reading. So 2025 is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, so I started my reading month with quite a few books on the theme of World War II. And it is also back to school month, so I read quite a few dark academia titles as well. I am also continuing my reading of the 2025 Booker Prize long list, and there are a few other books here and there. As per usual, I filmed all of my reviews in multiple sessions, and I have organized all of the titles by theme in the description below. Feel free to look at the timestamps and skip to the title that you are most interested in. Let's begin. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. Dr. Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration and death camps between the years of 1942 and 1945. So this book is his first-hand survivor account of his experience in these camps and his observations of human behavior in this extreme setting. This book is not strictly autobiographical, it's rather a combination of first-hand experience and observations with philosophical reflections and conclusions that he had drawn that would aid him in his work of psychiatry and therapy. As expected, the experience at these camps was bleak and devastating. He recounted that upon arrival, a lot of the people were still naively holding on to hope that they would be able to keep some of their family heirlooms or some important and precious jewelry, but then everything was taken from them and they were also completely shaved from head to toe. So they were stripped of their possessions and their dignity. And there was this very arbitrary process where a guard would point to either the left or the right, and 90% of the people were directed to the left where they were immediately executed, and the remaining 10% were put to brutal work. And there were some private construction firms that would pay coupons to these camps where they would profit from these prisoners' labor. And upon arrival, Dr. Frankl was asking the other prisoners there whether they had seen his friend, and they said, did he go to the left or the right? And he said left. So then they pointed to the smoke rising from the incinerator in the distance and says, there it is, there's your friend. And also in these camps, some of the prisoners were chosen as capos. So basically they were kind of turned against their own people to serve the will of the guards. So they were prisoners that would keep other prisoners down and monitor them. And some of them worked to put bodies into the incinerator, well knowing that they themselves would be replaced by another batch of prisoners. And a lot of the times these capos would be even more violent than the guards towards the other prisoners because they know that that kind of brutality is the only way that they would survive. By brutalizing the other prisoners, they earn the reward of survival. So all of these experiences make this a very devastating and heavy read. However, there are a lot of very interesting and I would say inspiring psychological and behavioral observations made by Dr. Frankl. One of the psychological phenomena that he observed is the delusion of reprieve, meaning that a lot of people facing certain death would suddenly have this delusion that maybe everything will work out okay, maybe they won't die, but of course that wasn't true. And also the phenomenon of relative apathy, meaning that a lot of people have just gotten used to suppressing all of their emotions because to not feel was the only way that they could survive. If they really reflect upon how horrendous the suffering was and the fate of their prisoners, then they would lose their will to live. So then this willful apathy became a coping mechanism. And he drew the conclusion that you're always free to choose your attitude no matter what situation you're in, and that a sense of meaning is the key to survival. And he went on to extrapolate this importance of meaning into logotherapy. Logo is the Greek for meaning, so basically he kind of devised this therapeutic method where helping the patient to find meaning became the solution to a lot of mental illness and disorder. So part 1 of this book is focused on his survival account within these concentration and death camps, and part 2 of the book is dedicated to logotherapy. Overall, I feel like I would recommend part 1 of this book over part 2. So what I mean is I feel like part 1 was more focused on the survival experience, and there's really no other way for us modern readers to understand this chapter of human history involving concentration camps and death camps than reading a first-hand survival account. And I think a lot of the observations and conclusions in chapter 1 were just more illuminating and inspiring. And when it comes to part 2, logotherapy, therapy, although this is incorporated into therapy methods by psychiatrists and therapists today, psychological research and therapy methods have come a long way since this book was published. So this book was first published in 1946 in Germany. So the local therapy in part 2 of this book, I feel like, was written as almost an end-all be-all to psychological issues and disorders. He said that kind of a lack of meaning or boredom can be the root cause of depression, addiction, and other behavioral problems. But with the development of psychology, especially the advancement of neuroscience, we now understand that mental health issues have much more complex causes and solutions. And a lot of mental health issues and disorders require medication in addition to just verbal or conversational therapy. He also argues that life is not about pursuing pleasure, but instead it is about pursuing meaning. However, anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure, is a main symptom of depression, which would indicate that pleasure is actually quite important to a healthy mind. And I would say that therapy today in general is a bit more complex and nuanced than just telling your patient to go find meaning in life or go find a sense of purpose and that will solve all of your problems. So I would say that part 1 of this book is a lot more valuable to modern readers, and part 2 should probably be taken with a grain of salt. All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This story is set in a French town called Saint-Malo during the Second World War, and it follows 2 protagonists. One of them is 16-year-old Marie-Laure. So she is a French girl who is blind, and her father worked at the Paris Museum, so they used to live in Paris. While she was going to school in Paris, Marie-Laure started hearing this story about a diamond called the Sea of Flames that is apparently very precious or brilliant, but it's also cursed. So while the war is escalating, Marie-Laure and her father had to flee Paris, and before they left, the Paris Museum gave several of their employees a stone that is either the real diamond or a decoy for it. So her father carried one of these stones and they escaped to Saint-Malo. The other protagonist of the story is Werner Pfennig. He is a German orphan, and he and his sister grew up in a children's home. And as he was growing up, he showed this propensity to be able to repair radios and just kind of a general talent for this type of electronic engineering in general. And because of this talent, he enlisted at the National Political Institutes of Education. So this was actually a selective military academy that was really a pipeline for the Nazi army. But being a young German boy, he didn't really have much choice in the way of social mobility and just general success. So he enrolled at this school and later joined the German army. So these 2 characters' lives actually became linked pretty early on in the story, but they don't meet until, I would say, the last quarter of the book. And it was revealed very, very late exactly how they were connected throughout most of the story. Overall, I enjoyed this story and I really appreciated the message at the end. However, I do have a couple issues, one of them being the timeline of this story being quite confusing and a little bit hard to follow. And this story jumps back and forth quite a bit. So it begins in 1944 where there was this impending air raid that's about to happen. So I did get the impression that 1944 was kind of the present of the story, anchoring all of the other events. And then it jumps back to, I would say, flashbacks ranging from 1934 to 1940, all the way to just a few months before that air raid in 1944. But it alternated quite a few times, and each time point contained a number of scenes that aren't necessarily connected with each other. So overall, there was a lot of just separated imagery that's presented by this story. I felt like I was mainly looking at images rather than hearing a narrative. And this author's writing style, I would say, is also quite fragmented. So a lot of the writing in this story, I felt like were sentence fragments rather than complete sentences. So you would see a lot of individual descriptors or expressions one after another. And because of that, I didn't really feel like there was a great flow to the writing. So this entire book is broken up into, I would say, micro chapters that are between 2 and 4 pages long, and the entire book is 530 pages long. So you're kind of just processing individual bits and pieces that jump back and forth in time. At one point, I felt like I was being handed like just a big box of old photographs that are all individual images, and I'm supposed to just look at these images and piece the story together myself. So that's probably my biggest issue with this book, just the frequent time jumps and this fragmented writing style and structure of the story, making it quite difficult to follow. Another issue is I feel like this is somewhat of a romantic look at the Second World War. And I have not really decided how I feel about this style of writing of war, where you feel like you're kind of looking at things through this sepia-toned nostalgic lens, where things like bombings and air raids are happening, but also there's this dreamy, detached quality to it. And if you've read this book or something in this similar style, I would love to hear how you feel about this type of approach to describing and writing a war, where the language feels very tender and kind of poetic and a little bit dreamy, versus, for example, how Han Kang would write a collective experience of violence and brutality, where she does not spare you the bloody details down to the smell of the corpses, and everything is very kind of in your face, and it's very difficult to escape that feeling of violence and bloodiness. So I would love to hear how you feel about this type of approach, where everything feels a little bit softened and more distant. But overall, I would recommend that you check out this book, because I do think it's a good story. It's quite unique, and also if you are an experienced reader who wouldn't mind a non-linear kind of narrative and you like this dreamy, more poetic type of language, then I do think you would really enjoy this book. The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This novel is narrated by Death. Yes, you heard that right. Death is the narrative voice in this story, and he watches over this little girl called Liesel Memminger and her life between 1939 and 1945 in the fictional town of Molking, right outside of Munich, Germany. Liesel was sent away by her mother to live with her foster parents Hans and Rosa Huberman, and unfortunately on the train journey there, her brother Werner passed away, and that was when Death first saw this young girl. She was devastated by her brother's death, so she stole a book at the train station called The Gravedigger's Handbook, and that initiated a long run of book thievery. So even before she learned to read or write, she had been very interested and very curious about books, and she had loved them, and she would just acquire them however she could. And after she arrived at her foster family, her papa, Hans Huberman, noticed her love for books and started teaching her to read and write. And from there, her love for books only grew, and she continued to steal and read and love many books from there. She also made friends with a boy from her neighborhood called Rudy Steiner, who was very obsessed with African-American athlete Jesse Owens, and together they made this dynamic duo who did their best to survive and navigate Germany during wartime. What I found really interesting about this book is that although the narrative voice is Death, it did not feel bleak or sarcastic or morbid in any way. Actually, just the opposite. This is a very human and very warm story. It's a very heartwarming reading experience. So although Death is telling the story, it really felt like he was looking at this world and the people in it with this childlike sense of wonder. It really felt like it was more seen from Liesel's perspective than Death's perspective. I think the author did a great job with painting a very vivid setting for this story and filling it with very likable and very empathetic characters. I think Liesel is a character that probably all book lovers and readers could resonate with, because she's willing to risk it all to acquire books and protect them. And Rudy just had so much love for Liesel. I mean, they're both kids, so it's like a very innocent kind of companionship and friendship. And there was this one scene in the book where the two of them were trying to retrieve a book that was like floating down the river because a bully had thrown it in. And these two kids just like diving into the ice cold cold river, shivering, trying to protect this book and trying to save it no matter the cost. I think that was one of the best, most memorable scenes I have read for a long time. And Papa Hans is a great representation of just an everyday citizen who is quietly resisting the Nazi extremism just by being unconditionally kind and very principled and helping the persecuted Jewish people whenever he could. And I also found Rosa to be a very interesting character because she was kind of a rough around the edges kind of woman, and she talked a mean talk. She would like curse out everybody, but then she would show with her actions that she is actually a very kind person. Like she would she unconditionally took care of Liesel and others who needed help later on in the story. I really enjoyed reading this book. I thought it had this cinematic quality to it. It's very cohesive and the narrative is very easy to follow. And I couldn't help comparing this book to All the Lights We Cannot See, given that they're both World War II novels following the perspectives of children. And I prefer this book to All the Lights We Cannot See by quite a bit. Actually, I just think this story is so much easier to follow. The narrative just made a lot more sense. There's no like constant time jumps or rapid switching of perspectives or like bits and pieces that aren't connected together and left to the reader to piece into one narrative. The way that the book thief presented this story just made a lot more sense to me, and it really did feel like watching a cast of characters whose lives are unfolding in front of your eyes. And I really did think the progression of the story just made a lot more sense, and the characters are perhaps a bit more representative of the people in that time and in that setting. So overall, I really enjoyed this story, and if you were to choose one between The Book Thief and All the Lights We Cannot See, I would pick The Book Thief. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book is probably the foundational work of the dark academia genre, and a lot of people say that this is actually the first true dark academia novel, and it's very much a cult classic. This story follows a group of students in a fictional liberal arts college in New England. It's supposed to be set in Hamden, Vermont. In the very, very beginning of the story, it is revealed that a student called Bunny had died, and the protagonist Richard proceeded to tell you about the story of this group of students. They are all studying classics under a professor Julian Morrow, and how the group dynamic gradually shifted and how one of them ended up dead. I picked up this book after reading The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt earlier this year. I think it says a lot to the author's writing ability that although I didn't enjoy that story, I still wanted to read more from her, because although I didn't really like the story of The Goldfinch, I thought her writing and the level of detail that she was able to put into her writing and the rhythmic flow of her sentences was really enjoyable to read. And I was not disappointed. I feel like The Secret History was a better story than The Goldfinch, just in terms of the progression of events and the way that you can really see the group dynamic developing and the way that like small things are revealed through dialogue between the characters, and you slowly get to know these people and your attitude towards them gradually changing, and you really feel like you get to know these characters and you really get to understand these characters. I think it's really amazing that knowing that Bunny had died and also very quickly finding out that he's actually a very unlikable person, I was still riveted by this story and just absorbed by every moment, and I was really curious to find out exactly how this death happened. And also the writing feels very gothic, not only in the very wintry and bleak landscape of New England, but also just in the way that the mystery was building, and there's this sneaking suspicion of the characters, and also there's certain kind of unexplainable, possibly supernatural narrative moments in this story, and also the dreams and the nightmares of the characters I think really added a gothic, haunting, ghostly feeling to the story. So I'm glad I read this story in the fall, but I kind of wish I read it in the winter instead. Just everything from the setting to the mood to the story itself, it just all has this really bleak and cold kind of feeling to it. There was this really standout scene featuring Richard at the end of the term because he was a financial aid student and he never told his classmates that he was actually quite poor, and he was kind of keeping up this facade of fitting in where everyone else had gone traveling or indulging in luxuries, he was living in a room with a hole in the roof. And during those moments, the feeling of cold just like seeping into his bones was very palpable and very memorable. And also snow played a major role, I would say, in the narrative events, also surrounding Bunny's death as well. So I would say snow actually had its own narrative significance in this story. And also one of the main characters is called Henry Winter. Not to be tongue-in-cheek, but once you get to know the character, you realize that he has this like cold, detached kind of personality that really fit his name. And his progression and like his role in the group dynamic was also really interesting. So overall, I really enjoyed reading The Secret History. I definitely understand why it's a cult classic. And I think I prefer this book to The Goldfinch by quite a bit, although the two share some common themes regarding being an imposter in a world of wealth and privilege, and also unrequited love. But overall, I just feel like this story is better done, and there are certain moments that I'm still thinking about, and I will definitely reread this book at some point. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of the most well-known and well-loved titles by Nobel Prize winner Kazuo Ishiguro, and this story is set in a very exclusive boarding school called Hailsham, located in the English countryside. And Hailsham is spelled with the words hail and sham. And once you know the story, you realize that this naming is actually very clever and very poignant. This story is told from the first-person perspective of Kathy H., who is a carer, and she is reminiscing about her life at Hailsham and her friends Tommy and Ruth. And this entire story is written with a very introspective and melancholic tone. So she remembers their experience at the school, Tommy getting bullied and how he later rose above the situation. And also they had all these like exhibitions where the students would display art that they have created, and then they can exchange these art for tokens, which they could use to buy other students' artwork or necessities that were brought in from the outside. And that's when the reader realizes that these kids were actually not allowed to leave this school, and their life is kind of entirely isolated from the outside world. And at no point are their parents mentioned. So this is a very strange setting, and the truth of it and why the world is the way that it is very, very slowly revealed. And there's also a pretty shocking twist near the end of part 1 as to why these students are there at that school and what their actual purpose is, which makes their prospects in life seem very bleak. And this is definitely a dystopian story through and through. Similar to Clara and the Sun, which is the author's latest novel that I reviewed earlier this year, this story also moves at a pretty slow pace, and it has a generally melancholic tone. However, I feel like this story is a lot more gripping just in terms of how certain information is revealed at different parts of the story, and it definitely keeps piquing the reader's interest, and it definitely kept the mystery alive. And in terms of the writing style, I feel like this one definitely read a lot more like a lost classic, just in terms of the elegance of the language and the very introspective tone of the narrator. It felt a lot more like kind of an almost Victorian protagonist or heroine, and the way that they would tell stories and reflect upon their experiences. And also, I feel like this book had more profound themes, for example, the value of art and how it revealed the soul, and also how people can sometimes turn a blind eye to others' suffering if they can benefit from such suffering. So overall, this is a unique story with profound themes and written in very elegant language. I highly recommend that you pick it up, and I personally can't wait to reread it. Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is a dark academia story set in Yale, and it follows protagonist Alex Stern, who was practically plucked out of a drug den and admitted to Yale because she could see ghosts. And she was admitted to Lethe House, which is the ninth house in this fictional universe, where there are 9 very ancient and powerful houses at Yale who can use occult powers to achieve certain means. And a lot of these occult rituals are performed using the bodies of vagabonds. So at the beginning of this story, Alex's partner Darlington was missing, and right after she participated in one of these occult rituals, the body of a young girl was found on the Yale campus, and the story unfolds from there. I would say that the central theme of this story is the issue of power and privilege in an academic setting, and it is pretty well illuminated by the fact that some of these occult rituals where they use the bodies of vagabonds, it was just to make financial predictions of, for example, how the stock market would perform. And the students in this story would refer to people of New Haven who aren't Yale students using the word town, and when they discover the dead body, Tara Hutchins, the students would very casually make comments about how she's town, meaning that she's not a student of Yale, and therefore kind of diminishing her death as being a lesser issue. And the story also explores some very dark side of academia, like racism, sexism, and date rape culture, and also how willing a university is to cover up all of these scandals. I think the author did a very good job here with blurring the lines of fiction and reality. I mean, the author was actually a Yale student, so I feel like her portrayal really added that extra layer of realness to this story. So although the occult aspect of this story is quite clearly unreal and fictional, the portrayal of this snobbishness and casual cruelty of a lot of privileged academic people felt very real, and therefore made the story very absorbing and engaging. Overall, it was a very entertaining read, and I am definitely interested in reading the sequel called Hellbent, and I think the author just hinted that there will be a third book released in 2026, so I'm very interested in seeing what more this fictional universe has to offer. If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is a dark academia mystery set in a fictional private conservatory where students learn the arts from theater to music to dance, all in a very competitive setting. And the main characters of this story are all fourth-year theater students, so they've survived a lot of the very stringent elimination process that happens at the end of every year. So now they've kind of made it in this very small, exclusive academic circle, and the stage was theirs, and they were performing a lot of Shakespeare. And in fact, a lot of the narrative in this story were actually told through selections of Shakespeare plays. A lot of selections from Caesar and Macbeth especially were used as kind of foreshadowing and plot devices as well in this story. So like I've mentioned, all of the main characters in this story are theater students, and the way that they interact and behave and talk are all a little bit melodramatic, I guess kind of stereotypical theater kid behavior. And I think the author was actually a former actor, I think a theater actor too, so a lot of this tone probably made sense to her, but for a person who is outside of that theater world, it can become a little bit much at certain points. And in terms of the character portrayal, I think the male characters definitely stood out more than the female characters. So the protagonist, Oliver, is not the most successful among this group. He kind of never got cast as the lead, and it's a bit of a surprise that he even made it to the fourth year, and his family was not the most supportive of his like theater endeavor as well. And the character James is very moody and sentimental. He's that like overthinking, like very sensitive type of person. And Richard is kind of the automatic leading man of the group. He's always cast as Caesar in every production of the play, and he kind of just assumes that the role of the leading man would fall on him. And gradually he started treating his co-stars with kind of a casual arrogance, at certain points even being like physically aggressive and rough on stage. And that gradually became a very, very big problem for the group. In terms of the female characters, Meredith was described as this femme fatale. She was very beautiful, and she does have this anxiety that people only see her for her appearance and don't take her seriously for her craft. And Ren and Philippa, to me, felt very kind of like an afterthought. Like they felt very vague and almost faceless. I still have trouble like describing these two characters even after finishing the entire story. So that, I would say, is one of the weaknesses of this narrative. In terms of the plot and pacing, there is a murder in Act 2, and this story is divided into 5 acts. So at the very, very beginning, we find out that Oliver was the one who was imprisoned for this murder, but the truth of it is very, very slowly revealed throughout the story. So I thought the pacing there, keeping the mystery alive, was quite well done. However, in the end, there was like a twist after the twist. If you read this story, I think you know what I mean. And I kind of felt like that twist after the twist actually took away from the story rather than like adding an extra layer of mystery. I felt like if the story would have just ended at that like additional character death that occurred near the end, it would have felt a little bit heavier. It would have had more gravity, I think. But that is just a personal opinion. Overall, I think this story was quite entertaining to read. I think the author did a good job with keeping the mystery alive, like I mentioned. So a lot of this story was told through Oliver. He was about to be released, and he was finally telling the truth to one of the original detectives on scene 10 years ago. And the curiosity of that detective who was about to retire, and he's finally going to learn the truth of this case. And that curiosity, I feel like, really transferred to the reader a little bit, and it kept me very curious and very interested. However, the language did feel a little bit over melodramatic at certain points, and also I did find the character portrayal to be a little bit uneven. However, I do feel like this is like a fun, kind of entertaining popcorn read to experience. So if that's the type of story that you're looking for, or if you're a Shakespeare fan, I think this is a good choice to read. Endling by Maria Reva. I picked up this book because it was longlisted for the 2025 Booker Prize, and just based on all of the synopses that I've read for the longlisted books, this one sounded more interesting. This story was set in Ukraine in 2022 when the Russian invasion was still kind of looming on the border, and it followed three main characters. One of them is Reva, who was a snail conservationist, and she lived in a trailer, which was also her lab. She was taking care of a snail called Lefty, who was the last of his kind, therefore the endling of his species. This snail was very special because the pattern on his shell swirls towards the left instead of the right. That's why he's called Lefty. And Reva was very cash-strapped, so in order to help fund her research, she joined the romance tours in Ukraine. So these romance tours are arranged by marriage agencies who would recruit like attractive Ukrainian women, and they would entice these foreign men, I think mostly American and Canadian men, at least in this story. So these men are single and they can't find love in their own country, so they thought traveling to an exotic location to meet foreign women would kind of up their chances for finding love. And the other protagonists, Nastya and Sol, are a pair of sisters who are also participating in these romance tours. Nastya was posing as an eligible bachelorette, and Sol is a interpreter or translator at these events. And they have their own secret, so they're actually kind of infiltrating the marriage industry to try to find their mother, who went missing while protesting these romance tours and the marriage industry in general. So when I was reading all of the Booker longlist synopsis, I had thought this one was a standout. It sounded very interesting, but now that I've read it, it was surprisingly disappointing, and I had several issues with this story. Firstly, during the establishing section of the story, during part 1, there was so much exposition that's told through like a very complaintive kind of tone. So when Reva was introduced, the story launched into this like really long-winded exposition about snails and the conservation of snails and the challenges that faces. And there was no plot yet. I was just reading the author kind of complaining about the state of snail conservation. And there are also very long expositions about the marriage industry, the romance tours, how these things work, what an event looks like, and also about the protests that Nastya and Sol's mother was engaging in. There was just so much telling instead of showing before there was any plot for me to be invested in. A lot of the times throughout part 1, the author would just drop the name of a character and then follow it with these incredibly long-winded backstory of the characters or their jobs. And then when the story barely got going, in part 2, the story suddenly became about the author. So this book is meta fiction. It's kind of experimental in form, and it's kind of a story that's also about writing the story, if that makes sense. So the characters quite literally just got on the road, and the story was immediately interrupted by a discussion of the author writing this story, the challenges of writing in wartime, how to approach writing about a war, how much dark humor was appropriate, and there's these like back and forth emails between her and her publishing agency. I just felt like the long expositions in part 1 was already kind of tiring me out, and then I was genuinely a little bit annoyed by the interruption, and I was a little bit frustrated. So then throughout the rest of the story, I made very, very slow progress. I was just putting this book down, picking it back up, reading like 4 or 5 pages sometimes, and just really wanted to put it back down again. And from there, I feel like the progression of the plot and the conclusion of the story was not terribly convincing. And overall, I just felt like the story wasn't strong enough to carry that much experimentation in form. So after reading this story, I was thinking back to reading Audition by Katie Kitamura, which was also kind of very experimental, and there was a lot of things that happened in that story that was very absurd. But that story I thoroughly enjoyed. Just I feel like from moment to moment, the progression of the story really convinced me, and also the way that Katie Kitamura wrote had such precision and elegance to it that I was just completely pulled into her writing. And the sentences flow together so nicely that you just kind of don't want to put the book down. Whereas in this story, I felt like the writing didn't really flow very nicely. The sentences were a little bit awkward, and the plot overall was quite chaotic and also just unevenly paced. Like there are scenes where nothing much happened and a lot of details were protracted, and then there were scenes that are very dramatic and violent, such as like people getting shot, and it was very quickly glossed over. So it was like you blink and you miss it, and it was such a big thing that happened. There were long sections that were moving quite literally at the pace of a snail, and then there were parts where you blink and something that's very exciting or very dramatic just passed by. So I was just never really pulled in by this story, and as it progressed, I felt like it became more and more absurd and less convincing. And I did not really like the ending either, which made me feeling a little bit sad because I had really wanted to read more about Ukraine. I read Andrei Kurkov a little bit earlier this year, and I really loved that story and his writing. Unfortunately, this one just left me feeling a little bit cold, and I do think I will keep searching about stories about Ukraine, stories written from a Ukrainian perspective, and just keep looking. So my next Booker Prize read was Flashlight by Susan Choi, but I lost a little bit of footage where I was talking about the synopsis. So at the beginning of this story, 10-year-old Louisa was taking a walk with her father on the breakwater, and her father was carrying a flashlight. However, later she was found unconscious and alone on the beach, and her father had disappeared. So this book traced the life of their family, her father, who was ethnic Korean and born in Japan, and her mother, who was American. And it seeks to solve the mystery of exactly what happened to Louisa's father. I really like the exploration of identity in the context of immigration. For example, Louisa's father was ethnic Korean and he grew up with a Japanese name. He later learned his Korean name, but after moving to America, he was referred to with an English name that was really the mispronunciation of his Korean name. And his own wife, Anne, was actually never able to correctly pronounce his name. And Anne herself also experienced misfitting and being misunderstood after their family briefly moved to Japan because she was American, she didn't speak the local language, and she immediately stood out as a foreigner, and she could not prepare the bento lunches that other mothers would prepare for their kids. So Louisa ended up being the kid with the smelly American lunch, which is kind of contrary to what Asian immigrant kids would experience in America. And as the mystery deepens regarding exactly what happened to Louisa's father, the geopolitical background of East Asia and the shift that happens in the aftermath of World War II became really central, and that ended up becoming a very interesting theme regarding what's happening within Korea, Korea's relationship with Japan, and the border between China and North Korea, and all of the political complexity regarding that region. So this is not something that you see very often in English language fictions, so I really appreciated that. However, this story felt overwritten, both on a word level, a sentence level, and the overall length of the story. There are a lot of words that are like unnecessarily complex or obscure. I think at one point the author used the word detritus to describe the contents of a purse, which just did not fit at all. And the sentences are very, very long and filled with multiple clauses, so it kind of really slowed down that feeling of rhythm when you're reading. And I feel like the moments in this story, the narrative events, were like over commentated upon and over analyzed by the writing. And also, the entirety of part 3, which was over 100 pages long, did not feel relevant to the story at all. And it was shocking to me how irrelevant it felt after I finished part 3 and then moved on to part 4, and felt like that was a natural connecting point to the end of part 2. And also, given the title of the book is Flashlight and the beginning of the story was set up between Louisa and her father, I would expect that father-daughter relationship, or at least those two characters, would be the central focus of this story. However, there was so much that's actually about Anne instead. And the mother is definitely crucial to the family unit and the family relationship. But the way that Anne is written, especially in part 3, just felt isolated from Louisa and her father. Maybe that is like a point that the author is trying to make, is this like international misfit between the couple and within the family unit. But given that my expectation as a reader was set up to be focused on Louisa and her father, I just felt like the narrative focus was misplaced. So overall, my impression of this book is very mixed. I picked it up because it was on the long list of the 2025 Booker Prize, and it was also longlisted for the 2025 National Book Award in the United States. And it is currently shortlisted for the Booker, but I can't really tell you how much I feel like the chances of winning this book has. Part of the reason being some of the shortlisted books are not yet available to American readers. I think the next shortlisted title that I would even be interested in reading would be The Land in Winter, which is not available to US readers until November 4th, and the winner of the Booker Prize would be announced on November 10th, so like less than a week before the winner is announced. And actually, truth be told, I'm less interested in that title than Sea Scraper, and Sea Scraper did not make the shortlist. And it is also not available to US readers until November. So I really can't tell you how much I would be rooting for this book to win, but just by how overwritten it is and how bloated it felt, and that like really long section in the middle that just did not feel relevant at all, I don't feel like this book is necessarily an award winner. And I did see other reviewers mention that another, I think previously Booker nominated book called River East, River West explored some of the similar issues in this book and did a better job. So I think I will probably pick up that title to read sometime in the future. The We Free Men by Terry Pratchett. This is another one of Sir Terry Pratchett's Discworld books, which is a series of 41 fantasy books that have recurring characters, and they all take place in the same fictional universe, but each of them is a self-contained story and can be enjoyed on its own or in any order. However, given there are recurring characters, people like to group them into kind of sub-series. This one is the first of the Tiffany Aching sub-series where the character Tiffany Aching is first introduced. Tiffany was a 9-year-old girl who wanted to be a witch when she grew up, and she lived in a place called Chalk Country, which is this really beautiful green landscape, and people farm sheep and they make dairy, and her grandmother, Granny Aching, was a very respected shepherdess. She also had a baby brother called Wentworth, who was described as being constantly sticky, maybe because he was always trying to eat sweeties. And one day when they were playing outside, Tiffany was just watching her brother. She saw these 6-inch tall, red-haired, red-bearded men that are covered in tattoos. In fact, they had so many tattoos, it turned their skin blue. And these men sounded very Scottish, and they were kind of using a basket as a boat, and they were I guess getting up to no good. So these were the Nakmak also known as the We Free Men, and they do a lot of fighting, drinking, and stealing. And one day Wentworth disappeared, so Tiffany, who was armed with nothing but a frying pan, went on this adventure along with the Nakmak or the We Free Men to go rescue her baby brother. And along the way, she was always inspired by memories of Granny Aching, who was all about giving voice to the voiceless, and she was this great champion of fairness and justice. And even the more powerful kind of authority figures of Chalk Country, such as the Baron, would come to Granny Aching to solve certain conflicts in a way that is fair and just. And really nothing slipped by Granny Aching, and she always had great and creative solutions that look like magic. I really enjoyed reading this book. I think this is probably one of the most entertaining and inspiring books that I have ever read. Like I mentioned, everything that Granny Aching stood for was all about fairness and justice and giving a voice to the voiceless. But I think another central message of this book is this sense of adventure and self-determination. Because if you think about it, Tiffany is just a 9-year-old girl, and all she had was a frying pan, but she was just not afraid of anything, and she was determined to go out into the world and figure out where had her brother gone and who is this mysterious villain that had stolen her brother and how to defeat her. So not only does she approach the world with this childlike wonder, I would say another aspect is this childlike courage. It's almost like she just never learned to be afraid of anything. And by the way, there's a talking toad in this book as well. And at one point, the toad was talking to Tiffany about how all the monsters were coming back because there's no one to stop them. And Tiffany thought for a moment, and then she said, well, there's me. I feel like when we're faced with challenges or obstacles in life, a lot of the times we could be held back by self-doubt or a feeling of learned helplessness, whereas there's this 9-year-old girl who just goes out into the world like, what do I need to worry about? What do I need to be afraid of? I've got a frying pan, let's go. So it's just really refreshing and inspiring to read this story. And as usual, it's filled with charm and humor in Terry Pratchett style, especially in the dialogue, particularly in the speech pattern of the We Free Men, because they sound very, very Scottish, and they have these like amazing expressions, and they have their own brand of humor. It's just overall very entertaining and very enjoyable to read, and it has a lot of inspiring messages that you can keep with you and keep thinking about. This is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This is a time-traveling sci-fi story that's also a romance between two characters, Red and Blue, and they each represent a different agency. So these two agents kind of travel through time, and they meddle with certain things very subtly to kind of change the course of history or future to ensure that their agency would win and remain in control. So throughout the progression of this story, they discover the presence of the other person, and they start developing this fascination for each other, and they start writing letters for the enemy agent to find, knowing that they will be at a certain place during a certain time because time travel. And the story gradually shifts from being told by a kind of a third-party omnipresent narrator to being told through the love letters that these two characters are writing to each other. But for a really short story, I think the audiobook was about 4 hours long, I did find this novel to be quite ambitious in scope because it does travel through space and time quite a bit, being a time travel story. At any moment, you could find yourself in like this ancient cathedral that's full of bones, or being a member of the Mongol horde, or watching Atlantis sink. So if you like a very imaginative, expansive story with a very original premise, I think this is definitely the story for you. However, personally, I did find the back and forth of the love letter a little bit too sentimental. I guess I'm just not really like a big romance reader, so when it got to that part, it felt a little bit coy, just the tone that the characters start using to talk to the other person. However, I did find the ending really, really clever. I felt like the story kind of came full circle, and I actually think this novel was more fun on reread because it did travel through space and time so much. I felt like I didn't really grasp everything upon the first listen, so I listened to it again, and kind of with the knowledge that you gain at the end in terms of what the characters were trying to do, or specifically what Red was trying to do, and then with that knowledge, when you listen through the whole thing again, you find these moments in the story where you suddenly understand why the character is there, or why the character is doing that, like why they're mixing blood with dirt and eating it, or why they're heating water in an MRI machine and drinking it. So this story is actually more fun upon reread if that's something that interests you. So overall, I do recommend this book for being a quick and entertaining read, and it is a very original premise. The way that it's written is also something that I have not seen in other sci-fi stories. And if you don't mind a little bit kind of sentimental, flirty, coy love letter writing being thrown in there, then I think you would really have fun with this book, especially upon reread. The Antidote by Karen Russell. This story is set in a fictional town in Oz, Nebraska, and it is set during the dust storm of the 1930s. Specifically, it unravels right around the Black Sunday of 1935, where a particularly bad dust storm kind of devastated this town and everything came to a reckoning. There are three main protagonists in this story. The first one is a prairie witch whose name we don't find out until quite a bit later in the story. She has this power where people can deposit their memories to her. So she has like a magic emerald ear horn where people would tell her their kind of deepest, darkest secrets through this ear horn. And then the person who has told these stories would immediately forget all of them. And then the prairie witch just kind of stores these stories or secrets in her own memory. And later, the person who told her these memories and secrets can actually make a withdrawal. However, during Black Sunday, something unexplainable happened and the witch lost a lot of her deposits. The second protagonist is a young girl called Asphodel Alensky. So her mother was murdered and she was sent to live with her uncle Harp, who is the third protagonist in this story. And the person that murdered Asphodel's mother is the Lucky Rabbit Foot Killer. So he is this kind of very storied serial killer that's supposedly operating in this town and has taken the lives of multiple young women. And he leaves behind a rabbit's foot as a calling card. And all of this is according to the sheriff of the town called Vic Isco. And Sheriff Isco claims to have caught the Lucky Rabbit's Foot killer, who is this 17-year-old vagabond who is intellectually challenged and he likes to play the violin. And he was supposed to be executed on Black Sunday. And we very quickly realize that this is a story where small town justice turns into injustice. And a lot of things are going wrong under the watch of Sheriff Isco, but he is this kind of authority figure who holds a lot of power and does not hesitate to abuse said power, and it is very difficult for people who know the truth or suspect of the truth to overturn his claims. And the abuse of power is only one of the themes in this story. It also touches on the Great Depression, the New Deal, and the portrayal and representation of people in media for the sake of political agenda. And also there's the issue of the uprooting of Native Americans and the erasure of their culture and history, and the destructive impact on the environment from these actions. As usual, I think Karen Russell did a great job with the storytelling, and I think similar to Swamplandia, she did a fantastic job of incorporating supernatural, kind of gothic, unexplained elements into a story that's set against a very real American setting. I think this fictional small town in Nebraska really came alive, and she did a great job with covering the historical context of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the New Deal, and how those policies were received by everyday farmers. So although these supernatural elements might require quite a bit of suspension of disbelief, the context and the setting just feels so real that it makes the story very convincing and very engaging. However, I don't think all of the themes that I mentioned before were equally well developed or well explored in this story. I think the issue of authority and the abuse of power is by far the most well represented and well explored in this story. And after listening to it for about a week, I would say that that was the issue that was front and center in my memory that I felt like was really at the heart of this story. The other ones, like the politically motivated media representation and the uprooting and erasure of Native American people, felt a little bit like they were kind of crowded to the outer edges of the story. However, I do appreciate that the author engaged with so many themes. A lot of them are like very real historical and legal issues that are worth further reading into, and I definitely feel inspired to read a little bit more about the Great Depression, the New Deal, and Native American history and erasure. But despite this slight unevenness in the exploration of the themes, I would still say that this story is very much worth reading. I found it to be very entertaining and absorbing, and it's definitely thought-provoking and worthy of reflection after you finish the book. My Sister's Keeper by Jodi Picoult. This is the story of Anna Fitzgerald, who was born to save her sister, but now she wants rights to her own body. So Anna's sister Kate has a very kind of rare and aggressive form of anemia, and Anna's parents kind of genetically engineered Anna to be an allogenetic donor to Kate, and that was why she was born. And a lot of people call her a designer baby. And throughout her life, she had been donating blood and bone marrow and stem cells. Basically, every time that Kate is in the hospital, Anna is also taken to the hospital as a potential donor to save Kate. And Kate's condition just continued to worsen, and now Kate needs a kidney, and it was kind of assumed that Anna would donate her kidney to Kate, but she didn't really want to do that, so now she is suing her parents for medical emancipation. Basically, she wants the right to control her own body, and she no longer wanted her parents to make any kind of medical decision on her behalf and make her donate any part of her body to Kate anymore. So this story definitely has a very interesting premise, and it kept me engaged throughout the story. And as far as I know, this is kind of the space that this author works in. She likes to choose these like very heavy moral dilemma or ethical debates, and a lot of these are inspired by real events. I think Anna Fitzgerald in this story was actually inspired by a real case. Although this story is fiction, it's not really a recount of the real world event, but that's where the author took inspiration. And I think one of her latest works features a black nurse who was supposed to treat a child, but the child's parents are like very racist and they refuse to let this black nurse treat their child, and then it led to some very grave consequences. So this is the type of premise that this author likes to choose, and I was definitely very curious about how this whole issue would turn out, and the story did sustain my interest quite well. However, I felt like the story was a little bit drawn out. Like the pacing seemed a little bit slower than necessary, and there are certain things that are added into this story that I did not feel like was particularly relevant to the central dilemma. Like, for example, the behavioral issues of Anna and Kate's brother, like his issues with alcohol and later showing other criminal tendencies. I was not really sure how that really added to this moral debate. And also the relationship between her lawyer Campbell and her guardian ad litem Julia, I felt was just kind of irrelevant to the story and how Kate and Anna were going to resolve this issue of whether she would try to save her sister or whether she wants freedom and rights to her own body. And also, I didn't really like the ending. I feel like the way that the story ended kind of undid all of this moral dilemma and debate that was going on throughout the story. It kind of made the preceding plot a little bit pointless, and I can't really say more because that will spoil the story, but yeah, I didn't really like the ending. But that being said, I found this story very easy to follow because I would say this author's writing style is quite plain and simple and straightforward. So this is definitely the writing style for readers that aren't looking for, convoluted sentences or complex words. It's very easy to dive into the story. So I would say that it's good for a quick and entertaining read that's easy to follow. And I really do appreciate the types of premises that this author chooses. I think they're very interesting. And I am curious to read more works from her. And I'm hoping that I would not encounter another one where the ending kind of undid the story a little bit. All Fours by Miranda July. This is the multiple award-nominated, highly polarizing book about a midlife crisis. The protagonist of this story, who is unnamed, just turned 45, and she decided to drive cross-country because at the beginning of the story, she revealed that a whiskey company had paid her $20,000 for a sentence that she had written that could be interpreted as referring to a hand job or whiskey. So with that money, she took off from LA to drive to New York for a meeting, and then when she got to Utah, she decided to stay at a motel and just blow all of her money renovating a motel room. And from there, she also engaged in this very strange affair with a much younger man who also happened to be the husband of the decorator that she hired. So like I mentioned, this book was highly polarizing, and I am firmly in the dislike camp of things. Just nothing in this story was convincing to me. Everything from the setup of the characters what they do, how they behave, how the main character is somehow somewhat of a public figure without exactly defining what she did or what she did well, but she has somehow found multimedia success, and yet she was having this intense midlife crisis. And everything regarding intimacy and sex and all of that in this story just made no sense to me. Like, from her being aroused by the idea that there might be a peeping Tom and then proceeded to masturbate, to her meeting the mother of the young man that she was having an affair with and hearing from her about his sexual awakening, and then the two of them becoming intimate together. Honestly, this whole book just felt like literary masturbation. It's very narcissistic and unrealistic, and also unnecessarily disgusting. There were a lot of disgusting scenes added in there that I can't figure out the purpose other than just to add shock value. For example, the scene involving the tampon. If you've suffered through this book, you probably know what I'm talking about. And also just the scene where the protagonist and her husband were removing fecal impacted fur from their dog's anus. And I happened to be eating lunch when I was listening through that part, so needless to say, that ruined my whole day. And also just using the liminal space as a motel room to kind of represent the liminal space of midlife. I mean, the idea of liminal space is just, it's kind of like a transitional, temporary state of things where everything is changing and you're only passing through to get through your destination, kind of like a temporary motel room or a moving vehicle. And the midlife is kind of like, I guess, the liminal phase of your life where you pass through it and everything changes. But if you're familiar with the idea of liminal space, that just immediately becomes very obvious. And also the ending was very wishy-washy, just both in terms of the conclusion that she reaches, in terms of the way forward, what she should do next, and also how she arrived at that conclusion. Not that any kind of conclusion would have saved this book for me. I feel like I've pretty much turned against it from the get-go. I guess while listening through it, I was hoping that somewhere along the way there would be some kind of redeeming quality, because like it was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and I think it's gotten some other recognition, recommendation from various awards and various book reviewers as well. But I never found any kind of redeeming quality suffering through this whole thing. And genuinely, this is a book that I regretted reading, and I do not recommend that you read it. So those were all the books that I read in September. I think among the World War II books, The Book Thief was probably my favorite. And in the dark academia genre, Never Let Me Go and The Secret History were definite standouts. And I would want to reread both of them at some point. And I really loved The We Free Men, and I will definitely continue my journey into the Discworld by Terry Pratchett. So I'm looking forward to another month of reading in October with all of the mystery, thriller, and horror books that I've already picked out. I hope you've enjoyed this reading wrap-up video. Please let me know in the comments below what you thought of my selection and my reviews, whether you're interested in picking up any of these titles, and please let me know what you've read in September and what you thought of them. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.